Well, we've just heard from the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak giving a press conference to wrap up his time at the G20 Summit. Of course, the focus of that has been the reaction to this Polish missile explosion. It's been dominating the discussions here all day. He was part of the G7 group of leaders, the biggest countries here at the G20 Summit, that met early this morning for what was described as being an emergency roundtable meeting to try to figure out what to do about all of this. The word here, some 7 or 8 hours later, is one of caution. They're trying to de-escalate the situation. He's calling for a full investigation to take place on the ground in Poland with US and European support before any conclusions are formally reached. While that takes place, there have been some conclusions reached already by certain parts of the media. There have been interviews with US officials who cited as saying that they believe this could have been a Ukrainian missile fired in defense against a Russian attack. There are other mentions from the US President Joe Biden, who was asked multiple times about this following that first meeting this morning. He said that the trajectory of the missile suggested to intelligence that he had seen that it did not come from Russia. And in the midst of all of this, the Russian Defense Ministry has denied any responsibility at all and has instead called this a direct act of provocation from whoever did fire the missile to try to inflame the already very tense tensions that have existed here with regards to the international community's condemnation of Russia for its entire military presence in Ukraine.
So that's the geopolitical story on the one hand. What are the leaders saying about the macroeconomic situation globally?
Well, it's all still very much tied into the same issue ultimately. Rishi Sunak himself just said during the press conference that we've just heard that really this Polish story also ties into the Russia story, which also ties in to the economic story. He's been one of the leaders really pushing the Russia, pushing criticism of Russia on all fronts, because he says this Ukraine situation is fundamentally the single problem the world is facing right now. He says that's causing the food shortages, the fuel shortages, and the energy concerns that exist across the world, particularly in developing countries, and particularly as we've seen the South African delegation raise here at the G20 across the African continent. Rishi Sunak says Russia is to blame for all of this, and that's why he's saying it's more important than ever for the G7 and the G20 to continue to up the ante with regards to ramping up pressure towards Moscow to withdraw entirely from Ukraine immediately, so that it's easier for the rest of the world to try and fix some of these food and energy supply problems for the benefit of all of those developing countries.
Yeah, I think they were saying that 6 months ago, weren't they? So, you know, in the absence of being able to influence that actually happening, what are they saying about how they're going to curb the impacts of a global recession, which is expected to happen?
Well, one small benefit from this G20 summit that at least some developing countries can look forward to is there has been some positive action with regards to food inflation costs, because just in the last couple of hours there's been an agreement reached between Turkey and the United Nations here at the G20, which has allowed the export of some 11 million tons of grain from Ukraine, which has been tied up and unable to be distributed. And that will, in some cases, directly go to some developing countries, including on the African continent, that have been waiting for so long to receive their usual supplies. Countries such as Egypt have typically been key importers of Ukrainian grain. This is a step in the right direction, says the Turkish president and the United Nations, who are trying to find ways to stop this blockade of Ukrainian exports, which has contributed to increased food prices in much of the developing world. Beyond that, though, there is frustration here at the G20 that so much of the discussions over the last 48 hours have been dominated by the Russia and Ukrainian situation, not leaving enough time for more discussion about how to do exactly what you've just said, which is how to curb global inflation and how to help many developing countries in particular deal with the increasing fuel and food shortages, which is one of the key agenda points that the South African delegation has been trying to push during its time here.
Yeah, Richard, thank you very much for your contributions during the G20 summit.